I think what Americans need to know is the total direct and indirect cost of the conflict.
There is so much waste, so much inefficiency, so much absurdity in what we're doing at the moment.
We ought to recognize that these two wars qualify at least as a contributing cause of the economic calamity that we are trying to deal with at present.
Your soldiers lose their life in Afghanistan, you give your blood in Afghanistan, you give your taxpayer money in Afghanistan, for what?
It now costs about $775,000 a year to put a soldier or Marine into the war in either Iraq or Afghanistan. That's about 3 times as expensive as any war the U.S. has ever had.
In today's dollars, the amount that we spent per troop in World War II was $50,000. We're spending 10 times that per troop in Iraq. We can expect that the per troop cost in Afghanistan is higher than that. I would expect that it will be between 20 to 50% higher cost in upfront cost per troop.
Afghanistan is very difficult to supply, and it becomes much more expensive to ferry the stuff either through Pakistan or to come in the other way from Russia and through the Caucasus states.
The whole situation in terms of supply routes into Afghanistan is very, very different than it is in Iraq. Now, in Afghanistan, you have a country which is mostly rural, which is mostly mountainous, which is not desert.
Afghanistan is completely landlocked, and so what we've had to do is, up until now, we've been sending the majority of the supplies, for example, oil, through Pakistan.
We're opening up this alternate supply route that gets into Afghanistan from the north that requires the cooperation of Tajikistan and several of the other stands on the northern border of Afghanistan. It's a much longer and tortuous, is going to be more expensive logistics route. So those costs are going to go up in a manner not commensurate with the numerical increase in troops, but above and beyond that.
Right now, the United States, through fiscal year 2009, will have committed and or spent more than $185 billion on the U.S. war in Afghanistan.
I feel like we haven't done the right thing on our part. You know, we spend so much money over here, but we don't spend it the right way. We, you know, we have HESCO barriers shipped in from the United States. We probably pay more in the shipping to get that over here than we could pay local people to build a wall around this base.
We found dozens, hundreds of examples of war profiteering, of enormous cost overruns, of money on which the Pentagon, using Pentagon speak, says it has lost visibility on, money that simply could not be tracked and accounted for.
These enormous funds that did go out to Afghanistan, but they were given, the money was given to contractors who subsequently subcontracted and subcontracted, and by the time you get to how much money reaches the ground, maybe 40 or 50% of that money actually reached the ground for the projects, because all these subcontractors were taking 10% off as profit.
Let me give you an example. The United States recently spent $160 million on building roads and digging wells and this sort of thing in one province here in Afghanistan. But the way that works is they're giving that $160 million to a preferred contractor who then goes and subcontracts this out to a local Afghan company. And the Afghan company will maybe get 10% of that. And everything in between is pocketed by that middle company. And so this is a massive amount of waste for American taxpayers, but also there's no oversight for the projects that are actually being constructed. I've talked to construction contractors that go and who are tasked with the job of building a well, for example, and they'll go and take a picture of some well out there that has already been built and show it to the Americans and say, this is the well that we've built. And they'll say, okay, thank you very much, and here's your money. There's no oversight, no accountability, nothing whatsoever.
Those wells, like those hand pump wells you see everywhere, how much you said that it's like $700 to $1,000 to build one of those. We've been paying like 10 grand per well.
The local Afghans from rural communities, when they come to Kabul and they see these international consultants who drive in Toyota Land Cruisers, who live behind barbed wire and blast walls, who have, highly paid, security guards that have swimming pools, that are importing food from America, realizes and gets angry that the money that was supposed to be for them is actually going really to sustaining a Western lifestyle for foreign consultants, as opposed to providing them with sanitation and wheat and local education.
Because since 7 years, every report, every information that received Washington from Kabul, it is wrong. For example, Washington received a lot of information report about reconstruction in Afghanistan. There is not reconstruction in Afghanistan. You cannot give me an example of reconstruction that the quality is good.
In Afghanistan, I've heard the statistics cited that there are more private security personnel, Afghans working for Western security companies, than there are enlisted personnel in the Afghan National Army. And even if that's just an approximation, it's a signal of a structural flaw in the U.S. approach to building up security in Afghanistan. There's been much too much emphasis on private contractors.
Companies, contractors who are employing their employees through shell companies. For example, KBR has employed many of its employees through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, which means that the company and the employees don't have to pay Medicare and Social Security insurance. And so what you have there is a situation where the U.S. government is giving money in the form of a contract to a company that is, on the other hand, undermining the viability of the Social Security and Medicare system. KBR therefore gets an advantage in bidding because it can undercut those competitors who are paying insurance for their employees. So it is a double whammy.
First, you have to hold contractors accountable. That can be difficult to do if they're in the private sector and their personnel are coming and going. And secondly, there's a problem of essentially the strategy. What are you really trying to build here? Are you trying to build profits for corporations that are domiciled outside the country, or are you building permanent national institutions inside Afghanistan that can gradually take control of the country and reduce the need for Western partnership?
How much are you and every American paying for the wars after taking into account so-called hidden costs like taking care of wounded soldiers?
Veterans, when they come back, are entitled to health care for a number of years that is free, provided by the VA. They're also, if they have a disability, which a very large percentage of them do, are entitled to disability compensation for the rest of their lives. These things are very significant long-term costs. And then there are also what we call social costs. In other words, these are costs that they are real and somebody pays them, but the government doesn't pay them. For example, if a veteran comes home wounded and his spouse or parent has to quit their job to become a full-time caretaker, and in 20% of cases this is what happens. If that happens, I mean, that person is giving up an income. You know, that is a loss to the economy and to the person. That is a social cost.
The indirect costs, for example, having to deal with people that are wounded, people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, for people who will require care from the Veterans Administration. If you continue on this current pace, what you're talking about is a war that will cost, by the end of this decade, close to $1 trillion when you count all of the costs.
The Afghan government budget, salaries for government officials, is about $1.2 billion a year. When you hire, 150,000 police officers, which is, what Obama would like to see, you have to pay that salaries. And the bulk of those salaries today are paid by the US government. So you really have a problem in the sense that Afghanistan is so desperately poor, and the fact that all the money for local police officers to government ministries such as the women's ministries come from outside, it is simply not sustainable.
What we've shown the world is that a sole superpower, without any opponent in sight, can spend, I believe now we're approaching $800 billion. Long-term costs may be more in the vicinity of $3 trillion, that we can lose 5,000 Americans, that we see another 30,000 injured. And this tremendous expenditure cannot stabilize two countries who together comprise about 1% of the world population.
You can't fight a war and finance it the way we have without it having an impact on the economy.
Common expression these days, doomsday budget.
We basically took all this money out of the U.S. economy, put it into spending which had which had no benefit at all for the U.S. economy, and added all of this debt, so we weakened our economy.
Well, millions of homeowners faced foreclosure last year, and many more still stand to lose their homes.
The housing market collapse created one financial crisis after another, and it often seemed as if the news could only get worse.
You can make an analogy, I believe, to the housing bubble and the Wall Street bubble and the bank bubble, in the sense that there's no adult supervision. That's a lot of the fundamental problem that got us into trouble on housing, banks, and Wall Street.
Congressional aides say President Barack Obama is now seeking $83.4 billion to fund the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan into the fall.
More than $185 billion.
$775,000 a year to put a soldier or Marine into the war.
Close to $1 trillion when you count all of the costs.
So perhaps we can look at the cost of the U.S. war in Afghanistan around the country. We'll start in the South, in Alabama. That state will pay, through fiscal year 2009, $1,695 million for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. All of these people in Alabama, plus 200,000 more, could have full health care coverage for 1 year for what Alabama will pay for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. In New York, it will pay through fiscal year 2009 nearly $17 billion for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. That's equal roughly to, another figure, nearly 2 million Head Start places. We can get to Arizona, that will pay $2.5 billion for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. 20% of Arizona residents are not covered by health care, and half could be if these federal tax dollars were allocated differently.
I think the real key is going to be letting the American people know the full cost and the duration of the conflict. Because if the American people are not willing to support this war, it cannot be waged and accomplished successfully.